there are many definitions of an emerging technology, but what I think we all kind of have in mind is something that is capable of changing the status quo. And there was a group, Rotolo and colleagues, who did a study. They looked at many different definitions, and what they found that there were 5 different attributes that all emerging technologies had in common. The 2 that I think are most important for this group on the phone today are the last 2, where we talk about the prominent impact and the uncertainty and the ambiguity. In particular, that last point is very important when we look at planning for security scenarios and evolve emerging technologies and how we can develop strategy and develop risk mitigation situations to counter some of these possible threats. The graphic that I have here very briefly is something called the hype cycle. There is a market research group called Gartner who develops this graphic every year, and it basically takes a lot of the most promising technologies that are emerging and maps out a cycle of when they will be developing, when they will plateau, when we could expect them to enter the commercial market on a widespread scale, and so forth. I think it's just a good picture to see what is currently out there. Some of these are here now that we probably are fairly familiar with, and some of them are still coming that haven't quite been adopted on a mainstream yet. If you go to the next slide, please, and we'll talk about why some of these emerging technologies can be security challenges. So I think the important thing is that we remember that these are things that we haven't really had to deal with yet. And that's what makes them, I think, such a threat. Typically, when you look at strategies, military strategies, homeland defense, things like that, we're planning for attacks, or we're planning for situations that are relatively well known. These new technologies, and we'll talk about some of those in a minute, are things that we haven't really had to come across yet. So they aren't necessarily things that have been incorporated into our traditional mitigation and risk strategies. I think the most important point on the slide, if you look at the very last one, this comes from the most recent National Military Strategy, where they actually stated that emerging technologies are impacting the calculus of deterrence. They increase uncertainty and compress decision space. And I think it's very important to keep in mind as we go forward throughout the 21st century, we look at the pace of technology and innovation and how rapidly things are moving. It's making it very difficult for us to plan on how these technologies can be used for both good and bad. Let's go to the next slide, please. You should see a large table, has 3 columns, risks, technologies, and examples. And this is basically where I took the nuts and bolts of what I want to talk about and condensed it into one table. And on the left, I've identified what I think are 4 key risks that we should be looking at in terms of some of the emerging technologies that are available and some that are on the near horizon. The middle column are technologies that I have identified looking at some other sources and some that are fairly well known already in use, of technologies that I think we need to take a hard look at and take some concern in how we address these. And on the right, we'll talk about some examples of how these technologies have already posed security challenges and risks. I try to stay away from kind of making up scenarios that I think are possible. I thought it would be better to actually talk about things that have happened. And so on the next slide, we'll actually talk about a few examples that might make some of these a little bit more clear. But if I could just take a moment to talk about what I think are the most important takeaways from this slide. Let's focus on that first row, the intellectual property theft. We'll talk about an example that has actually happened already. But I think what's important to remember, when you take a lot of these technologies, and we'll use nanotechnology as an example, it is very much an academic exercise. These nanotechnology is in use in a lot of many sectors. However, there's still a lot of research that's taking place in academia and within the government. And sometimes we tend to let down our guard at who we talk to about our research and how that's shared. We'll talk about why that's important later, that we think about how we protect that information a little bit better. I want to talk about the next one real quick, the loss of control. I think the Internet of Things, we can talk about some more of that later if anybody needs some more details. We're talking about the interconnected system of objects that have sensors and things that are connected through the Internet. Anything that's connected to the Internet can be hacked, and that obviously poses a lot of challenges. When we look at how new technologies can be used, we can talk about some really bad things. And a lot of these technologies I have listed, nanotechnology, synthetic biology, 3D printing, they have all been used or could potentially be used to make new types of weapons or enhance more traditional types of weapons. I think it's really challenging our notion of what we consider a weapon and what we consider a weapon of mass destruction. And then finally, the last one, we talk about what these technologies can do. They very much are pushing the boundaries of weaponry development, of our strategy, of what's capable with state and non-state actors. So I think it's important to remember that scenarios that were possible 7 years ago that we're still planning for could be very different even in the near future. Within 5 or 10 years, we may be talking about different types of capabilities that we never had to worry about before. So if you can go to the next slide, please. And we'll talk very briefly about a couple examples that I think will kind of illustrate the point I'm trying to bring home. So the very first one is actually in regards to artificial intelligence or semi-autonomous weapon systems. That whole platform is a very important part of the third offset strategy, and so I think it's important to mention it here. One of the issues when we talk about artificial intelligence is that we can develop machines that are basically capable of producing their own thought, of making decisions on their own. And as you can imagine, it would be very bad if a machine were able to make its own decisions and act without a human being. And so DoD has found that this is such an important part of what they call keeping the human in the loop, that this directive was issued that basically says that an unmanned system cannot fire on a human target or any target unless it's specifically authorized by a human operator. However, the problem is this. If you see the picture I have there, that is a Super Aegis II weapon system. It actually has software in it that is capable of identifying and targeting human faces. And so if we develop machines that are basically going to learn from themselves, as artificial intelligence is designed to do, at some point a machine will be capable of getting around the loophole of having a human in the loop. And so everything, even this directive, will be null and void. And so that poses some challenges, as you can imagine. Very briefly, let's discuss the other two I have here. The second bullet point, this goes back to the point where I mentioned we need to be careful about how we share research. A few years ago, there was a scientist at one of the Department of Energy nanotechnology facilities who actually pled guilty to trading some secrets with Chinese universities. This gentleman was a nanotechnology researcher who had information on a laptop, and he made several trips to China and tried to use this information to his advantage. The interesting thing is that he was a naturalized U.S. citizen, but he was originally born in China. So I'm not sure whether or not he still felt like he had ties there, or if this was something he wanted to do to help China or maybe some other connections in universities get a competitive advantage in the United States, but still very interesting. And finally, the last point is in regards to synthetic biology. Synthetic biology is a biological technique in which we can use proteins and other sorts of biological compounds to actually recreate biological processes or even make new organisms. And in fact, very recently, just a few months ago, researchers in the United Kingdom did develop the world's first artificial virus. It was 12 nanometers in diameter, which is extremely small. The concerning fact is that they did it just because they could. It was meant to be the development of a standard, as they put it. However, if you can imagine any actor, whether it's a state-sponsored or a non-state actor, that could potentially create artificial organisms, would have the possibility to unleash, a plague upon humanity we've never seen. We have a lot of natural defense mechanisms that have been developed to counteract viruses and things like that. We have vaccines. However, this would be something that would be unnatural, so there wouldn't be any way to prepare for something like this. So if you want to go to the next slide, you'll find another table. And specifically, I want to talk about something that we don't always think about, but it's kind of the contrarian view to using these new technologies as weapons. And this is actually in regards to terrorist activities or protest against facilities or against the use of emerging technologies. And so in about a 7-year period here, you can see a variety of different types of attacks and protests that have happened against nanotechnology facilities specifically. I think it's very interesting to keep in mind that, people often fear what they don't understand, and they often lash out with violence. And I think as we continue to see technology develop and new technologies advance, it's possible we may see more similar attacks in the future. The very last one mentioned in 2011 was actually supported by a group called the Olga Cell, which is a known terror group that has ties to Italian terror groups and dissidents. So I think it's very interesting that these aren't necessarily just angry students or environmentalists, that in some cases these could be facilitated by very well organized terrorist groups. If you go to the next slide, you'll see a picture of China and of Russia. And I want to just briefly talk about this. This goes to the point I made earlier about emerging technologies creating a new type of arms race. And in fact, Secretary Work had recently stated that China and Russia are our adversaries in a way, or competitors, because they're advancing capabilities that, as he puts it, could worry us. And in fact, we do know that China has several programs that are used to stimulate the development of technologies and improve innovation. With these two mentioned, the 863 program and 973, they both have very specific objectives to develop nanotechnology. And Russia has actually entered the game as well. RusNano is a joint stock company that was created to basically commercialize nanotechnology innovation within Russia. The interesting thing is we know that China and Russia have brokered many deals between each other regarding nanotechnology corporations and developments. And in fact, at one point, RusNano had actually solicited Chinese investors to invest in the company. So this is a very real partnership that has been developing over several years. And if you look at how scientific innovation is often used to develop military capabilities, therein lies the potential problem of us, kind of living out the scenario that Secretary Work has described. So if you go to the next slide, we will start to wrap this up here briefly. I just want to kind of outline that there are many emerging technologies. A lot of them pose some unique challenges that we haven't completely understood yet. But many of them are risks that we faced in the past with other technologies. And so I want to briefly touch on some possible ways that we can begin to mitigate some of these risks. I think this quote here is very enlightening, and I think probably where we need to start. That continuing to raise awareness of new risks and focus on contingency planning are essential to help reduce strategic surprise. Some of the most important things that I think we can do that are, relatively simple. First, I think, is to have more sessions like this where we just promote the awareness of emerging technologies, the risks that they could potentially have, and get a discussion going. Second, I think if you look at the third point, I think taking these concerns and incorporating them into more traditional educational curricula. I don't think we focus enough on what is possible or what could be possible, and I think that it's time that we start to evaluate that a little bit more, especially as technology is beginning to advance so rapidly. And finally, I think if you look at the 7th point, and I'm not aware if this is happening or not, if it is, forgive my ignorance, but I think it's important that we consider incorporating some of these scenarios, such as terrorist organizations using 3D printers to print undetectable weapons, taking things like that, incorporating them into real life training scenarios so that we can begin to evaluate how decisions may be made in a future operating environment. And if you go to the next slide, I just want to briefly mention a couple capabilities that we have here at HDIAC. If I've piqued your curiosity today, or if you would like some more information on anything I discussed, or if you just would like to work with us on any projects that fit emerging technologies and any interest you have, we offer 2 services that may be of interest. The first is the technical inquiry service, where we will provide up to 4 free hours where we can answer any questions that you may have about topics related to one of our 8 focus areas. We also have a pre-competed, pre-awarded contract vehicle. If the 4 free hours of research is not enough to answer your question, or if you have any projects that you would like assistance with, we can help you out and assist you in any of that work that you may have. And with that, if you want to go to the next slide, you'll find my contact information. I want to thank you for your time, and I will be happy to take any questions you may have.
Mr. Nichols, Bob Wilbur here from USASOC 9. Thank you for that presentation. So first a comment and then a question, sir. We've looked at broadening considerations of strategic risk in the early 21st century security environment, and admittedly we have not pulled in some of the risk factors that you've addressed here, so that'll be one of the things that we take on within the USASOC 9. But I go back to your front page, your first chart there, and it talks about the 5 key attributes that qualify as a technology as emerging, and note those 5. And I'd ask you, having done this for a while, you've been on this side of the fence for a while, taking a look at emerging technology and its implications for deterrence and defending our country. What is the one that you see most challenging now that those in the military need to see or start to factor in for how we are going to conduct operations in the future? And I know that's a little bit broad, but if you give a shot at that, I'd appreciate it, given where you sit, sir.
Yes, sure. Thank you. That's an excellent question. I think definitely the uncertainty and the ambiguity is something that really poses kind of that fog of war, because we don't necessarily know how technologies are going to be used. In terms of which technology I think may be the most important, or maybe understudied, if you will, I think really is the 3D printing. There have already been several instances where polymer type weapons have been printed and smuggled through X-ray detection machines, because there's very little metal, if any at all. The only thing that has to be metal with a gun is the firing pin, which you can use a very small amount of metal for that. So some of these weapons can be undetected. And also NASA is developing a 3D printer that they hope to use in future space missions, where they can actually use soil from Mars or from the moon to create things. So imagine if some of our adversaries were to get a handle of that sort of technology, they could literally sit in a cave somewhere and use dirt or sand from the desert and print just about anything they would need to fight us. So I think that that's really changing and will continue to change capabilities of actors that don't necessarily have the resources that we do, because it doesn't really matter anymore.
No, thank you, sir. I appreciate that. We'll factor that in accordingly. I turn it over to the external network here. Any team members from Arctic with a question for the MCO or any of the other nodes to include AWG or the J39? Go ahead.
No question. Dr. Vine, he has no question.
Thank you, sir. All right, Craig, let's go to the next presentation, please. Again, Mr. Nichols, many thanks.
Thank you very much.